The mountain man hadn't been touched in 20 years, until a stranger mistook his cabin for an inn. The wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, carrying the scent of coming snow across the jagged peaks of Colorado territory. Ezekiel Wade pressed his weathered hands against the rough-hewn logs of his cabin wall and felt the structure shudder under the autumn storm's assault. 20 years he'd lived in this place. 20 years since he'd climbed these mountains seeking solitude and found exactly what he'd been looking for: the silence, the emptiness, the blessed absence of human voices that had once meant everything to him and now seemed like echoes from another man's life. He moved away from the window, his boots heavy on the planked floor he'd laid himself with timber cut from the very trees that surrounded him. The cabin was small but solid, built to withstand the brutal winters that claimed lesser structures and weaker men. One room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, with a stone fireplace that had kept him alive through more blizzards than he cared to count. Shelves lined the walls, holding his few possessions: tools, books worn soft from reading, jars of preserves, and ammunition for the Henry rifle that hung above the mantel. Everything a man needed and nothing more. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room as Ezekiel settled into his chair, a piece he'd carved himself from a fallen oak. His hands, scarred from years of working wood and stone, wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had grown cold while he stood watching the storm. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and a beard that hadn't seen a barber's touch in 2 decades. His eyes, once bright blue like summer sky, had faded to the color of winter ice, reflecting a soul that had learned to live without warmth. The storm raged for 3 days, dumping snow across the mountain passes and turning the world into a white wilderness that few could navigate. Ezekiel had weathered such storms before, but this one felt different somehow, carrying with it a restlessness that made him pace the confines of his cabin like a caged animal. On the 3rd evening, as the wind finally began to die and the snow tapered to gentle flakes, he heard something that made him freeze in place. Hoofbeats, the slow, labored sound of a horse struggling through deep drifts. No one came to his cabin. No one even knew it existed, except for old Murphy at the trading post 40 miles down the mountain, and Murphy respected his privacy enough to keep his location secret. Ezekiel reached for his rifle, checking the load with practiced hands as the sound grew closer. Through the frost-covered window, he could make out a dark shape emerging from the tree line, a horse and rider barely visible against the white landscape. The rider slumped forward in the saddle, and even from a distance, Ezekiel could see the exhaustion in the figure's posture. The horse stumbled, nearly going down in a drift before recovering and plodding forward with the determined gait of an animal pushed beyond its limits. Ezekiel watched as they approached his cabin, noting the way the rider's head lifted at the sight of the glowing windows, the way hope seemed to straighten tired shoulders. A knock came at his door, soft and hesitant. Ezekiel stood motionless, rifle in hand, waiting. The knock came again, followed by a voice that made his breath catch in his throat. A woman's voice, weak with cold and fatigue. "Please," she called through the thick wooden door, "I can pay for a room. I just need shelter for the night." Ezekiel closed his eyes, fighting against instincts that had kept him alive and sane for 20 years. He'd built this life in the mountains precisely to avoid moments like this, to escape the complications that came with human contact. But the voice outside his door held a note of desperation that struck something deep inside him, something he'd thought was long dead. "There ain't no inn here, miss," he called back, his voice rusty from disuse. A long silence followed, broken only by the wind whistling through the pines, then softer now, almost defeated. "Please, my horse is done for, and I can't feel my hands. I'll pay whatever you ask." Ezekiel stood frozen, torn between the safety of solitude and something else, something that felt dangerous and necessary at the same time. Through the window, He could see the woman's horse standing with its head down, sides heaving with exhaustion. Steam rose from its coat in the cold air, and he knew the animal wouldn't survive another night in the open. Against every instinct he'd cultivated, Ezekiel set down his rifle and unbarred the door. The woman who stumbled inside was small and slight, wrapped in a heavy coat that had once been fine, but now showed the wear of hard travel. Snow clung to her dark hair, which had escaped from a practical bun to frame a face pale with cold. Her eyes, wide with relief and something that might have been fear, were the color of rich earth after rain. "Thank you," she whispered, swaying on her feet. "I thought I was going to die out there." Ezekiel caught her as she began to fall, his hands automatically steadying her slight frame. The contact sent a shock through him that had nothing to do with the cold. It had been 20 years since he'd touched another human being, 20 years since he'd felt the warmth of skin against skin. He released her quickly, as if burned, and stepped back. "You're half froze," he said, his voice gruff with discomfort. "Get by the fire." She moved toward the hearth on unsteady legs, and Ezekiel found himself noting details against his will. The way she favored her left foot, the careful way she held her right arm, the mud and wear on her traveling clothes that spoke of hard miles behind her. She wasn't running toward something, he realized. She was running away. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said, holding her hands toward the flames. "I was heading for Pueblo, but the storm caught me. I saw your lights and thought—" She trailed off, looking around the single room with eyes that took in everything. "I thought this was an inn or a trading post, perhaps." "It's neither," Ezekiel replied, moving to the window to check on her horse. The animal stood where she'd left it, reins trailing in the snow. "That horse needs tending, or it'll be dead by morning." "Oh," Clara said, turning from the fire with guilt written across her features. "I forgot. I'm so tired I can barely think straight." Ezekiel pulled on his coat and boots, wrapping a scarf around his neck. "I'll see to it. You stay warm." Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it. The sharp air helped clear his head of the confusion that had settled there the moment Clara Whitmore stumbled through his door. He caught the horse's reins and led it to the small lean-to he'd built for his own mount, a sturdy bay that whickered a greeting from its stall. The woman's horse was a mare, a good one despite her current condition. Ezekiel rubbed her down with handfuls of straw, working warmth back into muscles that had carried their burden through impossible conditions. He gave her feed and water, checking her hooves for ice and stones. The work was familiar and calming, a routine that helped him think. What was he doing? In 20 years, he'd never let another soul cross his threshold. He'd built this life to be alone, to escape the memories and the guilt that had driven him into the mountains in the first place. Clara Whitmore, with her tired eyes and obvious secrets, represented everything he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. But when he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice from his beard, he found her asleep in his chair by the fire. She'd curled up like a child, her head pillowed on one arm, dark lashes casting shadows on pale cheeks. In sleep, the tension left her face, and he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or 30. Pretty, too, though she tried to hide it under practical clothes and a severe hairstyle. Ezekiel stood watching her sleep, feeling something twist in his chest that he didn't want to name. She looked fragile in the firelight, vulnerable in a way that made his protective instincts stir despite his better judgment. He knew he should wake her, send her on her way at first light, and return to the blessed emptiness that had been his companion for so long. Instead, he found himself moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire and preparing a pallet of blankets on the floor. He would give her his bed and sleep by the hearth, just for one night. Come morning, when the storm passed and the trails were clear, she would go on to Pueblo, or wherever she was really heading, and his life would return to its familiar rhythms. But as he settled onto the makeshift bed with his back to the dying fire, Ezekiel found sleep elusive. The presence of another person in his sanctuary felt overwhelming, like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples in all directions. He could hear her breathing, soft and even, and smell the faint scent of her hair, like wildflowers after rain. Morning came grey and cold, with fresh snow dusting the world outside. Ezekiel woke to find Clara still sleeping in his chair, but now she was shivering despite the heavy quilt he'd draped over her during the night. When he built up the fire, the sound woke her, and she opened her eyes with the startled awareness of someone accustomed to danger. "It's all right," he said quietly, not turning from the hearth. "Just morning." She sat up slowly, wincing as stiff muscles protested. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep in your chair." "No harm done." Ezekiel hung a kettle over the flames and reached for his coffee pot. "Storm's past. You'll be able to travel today." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and when he glanced at her, he saw something like disappointment flicker across her features. "Of course. I should be getting on." But when she tried to stand, her left leg buckled, and she caught herself against the chair's arm with a sharp intake of breath. Ezekiel was beside her in an instant, steadying her with gentle hands. "What's wrong with your leg?" "Nothing," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just stiff from the cold." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed as he took in the careful way she held herself, the way she'd favored that leg the night before. "Let me see." "No, I'm fine, really." But when she tried to walk, she couldn't hide the limp, and Ezekiel saw her bite back a cry of pain. Without asking permission, he scooped her up and carried her to his bed, setting her down as gently as he could manage with hands that trembled slightly from the contact. "What happened?" he asked, his voice stern but not unkind. Clara looked away, her jaw set in stubborn lines. "I told you it's nothing." Ezekiel knelt beside the bed and carefully lifted the hem of her riding skirt, revealing a boot that was clearly too small for her swollen foot. When he unlaced it and eased it off, Clara couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. Her ankle was twice its normal size, mottled purple and black with bruising. "This is bad," Ezekiel said, his weathered hands gentle as they examined the injury. "How long have you been walking on this?" "4 days, Clara whispered, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "Maybe 5. I lost track after the 2nd day." Ezekiel looked up at her face, seeing past the stubborn pride to the exhaustion and pain she'd been hiding. "You can't travel on this. Not for days, maybe weeks." "I have to," she said, struggling to sit up. "I can't stay here. I won't impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." "Hospitality?" Ezekiel's laugh held no humor. "Miss, I haven't had a visitor in 20 years. I don't know the first thing about hospitality. But I know about injuries, and I know you're not going anywhere on that ankle." Clara's face crumpled, and for a moment he thought she might cry. Instead, she set her jaw and met his eyes with fierce determination. "Then I'll pay you for room and board until I can travel. I have money." Something in her tone made Ezekiel study her more carefully. The expensive fabric of her traveling dress, now stained and torn, the quality of her boots despite their poor fit, the cultured way she spoke, like someone educated and refined. She was running from something, all right, and she had the resources to make it worth her while. "I don't want your money," Ezekiel said finally, "but you can't travel, and I can't in good conscience send you out to die in the mountains, so you'll stay until you heal. But understand, this is temporary. Soon as you can sit a horse, you're gone." Clara nodded, relief evident in every line of her body. "Thank you. I promise I won't be any trouble." But trouble, Ezekiel thought as he prepared a poultice for her ankle, had already arrived the moment she'd knocked on his door. The question was, what kind of trouble she'd brought with her, and whether he could survive having his carefully constructed solitude shattered by this slight woman with secrets in her eyes. Over the following days, a strange routine developed in the mountain cabin. Ezekiel tended Clara's injury with the skill of someone who doctored himself through many mishaps over the years. He made poultices from herbs he gathered in the forest, wrapped her ankle in strips of clean cloth, and insisted she keep it elevated and still. Clara, for her part, proved to be a surprisingly easy houseguest despite her injury. She was quiet, respectful of his space, and insisted on helping from the bed where he'd installed her. She mended his clothes with neat stitches, prepared vegetables for their simple meals with her hands while keeping her foot elevated, and even read aloud from his books in the evenings. Her voice, cultured and warm, filled the cabin with something it had never held before, the sound of companionship. "You read well," Ezekiel commented one evening as she finished a chapter from his worn copy of Dickens. "I was a teacher," Clara replied, closing the book carefully. Before what?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, "Before I had to leave." Ezekiel wanted to ask more, but something in her tone warned him away. Instead, he tended the fire and listened to the wind outside, content for now with the small revelation she'd offered. As days passed, he found himself looking forward to their quiet conversations, to the way she laughed at his dry observations about the world, to the comfortable silence that could stretch between them without awkwardness. It had been so long since he'd shared space with another person that he'd forgotten how it could feel, this gentle rhythm of companionship. But he also noticed things that troubled him, the way Clara startled at unexpected sounds, how she always positioned herself where she could see both the door and the window from her bed, the careful way she asked about trails and towns, as if memorizing information she might need quickly, and sometimes, in unguarded moments, he caught an expression of deep sadness in her eyes that spoke of losses he couldn't imagine. "What are you running from?" he asked one morning as he changed the dressing on her ankle. The swelling had gone down considerably, and the bruising was fading from purple to yellow-green. Clara's hands stilled in her lap. "What makes you think I'm running from anything?" 20 years alone teaches a man to read sign," Ezekiel replied. "You're traveling light, carrying cash instead of belongings, and you jump every time a branch creaks outside. Either you're running from something, or you're heading toward trouble you want to be ready for." She was quiet for a long moment, then surprised him by asking, "What are you running from?" The question hit him like a physical blow, and Ezekiel felt his carefully constructed walls slam back into place. "That's not your business. Neither is my story yours," Clara replied softly. "But we're both here, both hiding from something. Maybe that's enough for now." Ezekiel finished wrapping her ankle in silence, his jaw tight with emotions he didn't want to examine. She was right, of course. They were both refugees from their own pasts, seeking shelter in the same remote place, but acknowledging that connection felt dangerous, like admitting to something that might change everything. That night, as Clara slept in his bed and he dozed fitfully by the fire, Ezekiel found himself remembering things he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Sarah's laugh, bright and warm like summer sunshine, the way their daughter Lucy had felt in his arms, small and perfect and trusting. The fever that had taken them both in the span of a week, leaving him alone with grief so profound it had nearly destroyed him. He'd been a different man then, a sheriff in a small town called Cedar Ridge, down in the Arkansas River Valley. The loss had broken something fundamental inside him, something that had never healed properly. He'd tried to continue, to keep serving his community and honoring their memory, but the weight of it had been too much. One day he'd simply walked away from everything he'd known and climbed into these mountains to find peace in solitude. But now, watching Clara sleep in the firelight, he felt the old wounds stirring, not healing exactly, but shifting, like bones that had been set wrong and were trying to find their proper place. Her presence in his sanctuary was forcing him to remember not just the pain of loss, but the joy that had preceded it. By the end of the second week, Clara's ankle was much improved, though still tender. She could walk around the cabin without much difficulty, though she was careful not to put too much weight on it. Ezekiel knew it wouldn't be long before she'd be ready to travel. The knowledge should have brought relief, but instead, he felt something that might have been dread. "I should check on the trail conditions," he said one morning, pulling on his coat. "See if the passes are clear yet." Clara looked up from the pot of stew she was stirring while seated in his chair, her injured foot propped up on a small stool. He caught something like panic flash across her features before she schooled her expression to calm. "Of course. It's time I was moving on." But when Ezekiel returned from his scouting trip that evening, he found Clara sitting by the fire with tears streaming down her face. In her hands was a letter, creased and worn from much handling. "Clara?" He knelt beside her chair, concerned by her obvious distress. "What's wrong?" She looked up at him with eyes full of anguish. "I lied to you. About why I'm here, about who I am, about everything." Ezekiel waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him would change things between them irrevocably. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears. "But I'm not just a teacher. I was married to a man named Victor Blackwood." The name meant nothing to Ezekiel, but the way she said it, with such pain and fear, told him everything he needed to know about the marriage. "He's a powerful man, wealthy, respected in Denver." Clara's laugh held no humor. "Or he was, until I discovered what he really was. The things he did to people who crossed him, the women who disappeared when they threatened to expose his secrets." Ezekiel felt a cold anger building in his chest. "Did he hurt you?" Clara's hand went unconsciously to her ribs, a gesture that confirmed his suspicions. "Not at first. He was charming when we met, attentive and kind. I was teaching at a school for young ladies in Denver, and he was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. It wasn't until after we were married that I saw his true nature." "What happened?" "I found evidence of his crimes, documents, letters, proof of things that would have hanged him if they'd come to light. When I confronted him about it, She shuddered, unable to continue. "You don't have to tell me," Ezekiel said gently. "I do," Clara replied, "because you deserve to know what kind of danger I've brought to your door. He beat me that night badly, told me that if I ever spoke of what I knew, he'd kill me and make it look like an accident. I believed him. I'd seen what happened to others who'd crossed him." Ezekiel's hands clenched into fists, and he had to fight the urge to hit something. The thought of anyone hurting Clara, this gentle woman who'd brought such unexpected light to his dark existence, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in 20 years. "So, you ran," he said. Clara nodded. "I took the documents and what money I could carry and fled in the middle of the night. I thought I could get to California, lose myself somewhere he'd never find me, but I underestimated his reach. He has men looking for me, and they're getting closer." She held up the letter with shaking hands. "This was tucked under my saddle when I woke this morning. One of his men must have followed my trail partway up the mountain before losing it in the storm. It's a message from Victor. He knows I'm somewhere in these mountains, and he's offering a reward for information about my whereabouts." Ezekiel took the letter and read it, his expression growing darker with each word. The message was clear. Victor Blackwood would pay handsomely for the return of his beloved wife, and he was prepared to be generous with anyone who helped him find her. Between the lines, however, was an equally clear threat. Those who aided Clara would face consequences. "How long do you think you have?" Ezekiel asked. "I don't know. The storm covered my tracks for a while, but they'll find this place eventually." "I should leave tomorrow, try to get further into the mountains before they figure out where I've been hiding. On that ankle? In this weather? You'd die of exposure before you made it 10 miles. Better that than what Victor will do to me if he catches me." Clara's voice was steady, but Ezekiel could see the terror she was trying to hide. "And better than bringing his wrath down on you for helping me." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he weighed his options. He could help her pack, give her supplies, and send her on her way with directions to the safest trails. It was what any reasonable man would do, the smart choice that would preserve the solitude he'd built his life around. But when he looked at Clara, saw the courage she was trying to summon despite her obvious fear, he knew he couldn't do it. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, this woman had become important to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The thought of her facing danger alone, of never knowing whether she'd found safety or met the violent end her husband promised, was unbearable. "No," he said finally. "No? You're not leaving. Not like this." Ezekiel met her eyes steadily. "We'll face this together." Clara stared at him in shock. "You don't understand. Victor is dangerous. He has money, influence, men who'll do anything he asks. If you help me, you'll be marked for death same as I am." "I've been dead for 20 years, Ezekiel replied quietly. "Maybe it's time I started living again." If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Old West stories. The next morning, Ezekiel began preparations with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd once faced down armed outlaws for a living. He cleaned and checked his weapons, taking inventory of ammunition and supplies. He scouted the area around his cabin, noting every trail and hiding place, every vantage point that could be used by approaching enemies. Clara watched him work with growing amazement, carefully moving around the cabin to help as her ankle allowed. This was not the solitary mountain hermit she'd come to know over the past weeks. This man moved with purpose and confidence, his eyes alert and calculating. When he spoke of tactics and defensive positions, she heard the voice of someone who'd faced violence before and survived. "You weren't always a mountain man," she observed, as he showed her how to load and fire his spare Colt revolver. "No," Ezekiel replied, not looking up from the weapon he was teaching her to handle. "I was a lawman once, sheriff of a town called Cedar Ridge, down in the Arkansas Valley." "What happened?" Ezekiel was quiet for so long, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "I lost everything that mattered to me, my wife Sarah, my daughter Lucy. Fever took them both and I couldn't save them, couldn't even say goodbye properly." Clara felt her heart break a little at the anguish in his voice. "I'm so sorry. After they died, I tried to keep going, to keep doing my job, but everything reminded me of them. The town, the people, the life we'd built together. One day I just couldn't take it anymore. I packed what I could carry, rode up into these mountains and never looked back." 20 years, Clara whispered. "You've been alone for 20 years. It seemed easier that way, less painful." Ezekiel finally met her eyes. "But I was wrong. I wasn't living, just existing, hiding from the world instead of facing it. And now I have something worth fighting for again." The simple statement hit Clara like a physical blow. In it, she heard an echo of her own transformation. The broken woman who'd stumbled to his door 3 weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who'd remembered what it felt like to be valued and protected. They spent the day preparing, but as evening fell, both knew their time was running out. Clara's ankle was much better, but still not strong enough for the kind of flight they might soon need. And somewhere in the mountains below, Victor's men were closing in. It was Clara who spotted them first. 3 riders picking their way up the narrow trail that led to the cabin. She called to Ezekiel, who took one look through his spyglass and began issuing terse instructions. "Take the rifle and go to the back window. Keep your weight off that ankle, but be ready to shoot if I tell you to. These men aren't here to talk." Clara obeyed without question, though her hands shook as she took up position. Through the small window, she could see the riders approaching slowly, their eyes scanning the cabin and surrounding area with professional thoroughness. These were not casual bounty hunters. They were killers, and they'd been sent to bring her back, dead or alive. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his left cheek, called out when they were still 50 yards away. "Ezekiel Wade, we know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to Mr. Blackwood. Send out the woman, and nobody has to get hurt." Ezekiel stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled casually in his arms. "I don't know what you're talking about, friend. Haven't seen hide nor hair of any woman up here." The scarred man laughed. "Don't play games with us, Wade. We followed her trail right to your door. Mr. Blackwood is prepared to pay generously for her return, and just as prepared to make things unpleasant for anyone who stands in his way." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise. You've got 1 minute to send her out, or we come in and get her ourselves." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, and Clara could see him weighing their options. 3 armed men against 1, with her as a wounded liability rather than an asset. The smart play would be to surrender, to hand her over, and hope they kept their word about letting him live. Instead, he called back, "I've got a counteroffer. You boys turn around and ride back down that mountain, and I'll let you keep breathing." The scarred man's face darkened. "You think you can take on all 3 of us, old man? I think you'd be surprised what a man can do when he's got something worth protecting." Without warning, one of the riders spurred his horse forward, drawing his gun as he charged the cabin. Ezekiel's rifle cracked once, and the man tumbled from his saddle to lie motionless in the snow. The other 2 took cover behind trees, their horses wheeling in panic. "That was a mistake, Wade," the leader shouted. "Now you're both going to die." What followed was a brutal firefight that seemed to last forever, but probably took no more than minutes. The 2 remaining gunmen tried to flank the cabin, but Ezekiel had chosen his ground well. The building sat in a small clearing with open approaches on all sides, and he'd spent years learning every inch of the surrounding terrain. Clara found herself firing through the rear window at a shadow that moved between the trees, careful to keep her injured ankle supported. She couldn't tell if her shots found their mark, but the act of fighting back filled her with a fierce satisfaction. The noise was deafening. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the cabin, and through it all she could hear Ezekiel's steady voice calling out directions and encouragement. The end came suddenly. The scarred leader made a desperate rush for the cabin's front door, perhaps hoping to end the fight with superior numbers in close quarters. But Ezekiel was waiting for him, and his shotgun blast at close range settled the matter definitively. In the sudden silence that followed, Clara could hear her own heart pounding and the distant sound of horses disappearing down the mountain trail. The 3rd gunman, faced with the deaths of his companions and the prospect of fighting a clearly superior opponent, had chosen discretion over valor. "Is it over?" Clara whispered. Ezekiel moved carefully to check on their fallen enemies, his weapons still ready. "For now, but that one who ran will report back to Blackwood. We've bought ourselves some time, but not much." Clara joined him on the porch, limping slightly, but moving much better than she had days before. Looking down at the bodies in the snow, she should have felt horror or revulsion, but instead she felt only a grim satisfaction. These men had come to drag her back to a life of abuse and terror. They'd gotten what they deserved. "What now?" she asked. Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment, then surprised her by smiling. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his weathered features completely. "Now we disappear. There are places in these mountains where even Blackwood's money can't reach. Caves and hidden valleys where we can wait out the winter, maybe longer if we need to. You didn't think I'd let you face this alone, did you?" Ezekiel's voice was gentle but firm. "We're partners now, Clara, in this fight and whatever comes after." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than fear. For the first time in months, she felt safe. More than safe. She felt like she'd found something she'd never even known she was looking for. They spent the next hour gathering supplies and preparing for a hard journey into the deep wilderness. As they worked, Clara found herself studying Ezekiel's profile in the firelight, marveling at the transformation she saw there. The lonely, broken man who'd opened his door to her weeks ago was gone. In his place was someone vital and purposeful, someone who'd remembered what it meant to have something worth fighting for. Ezekiel! she said as they finished packing. What happens after? When this is all over? When Victor is no longer a threat? What then? He looked up from the saddle he was adjusting, meeting her eyes with an expression that took her breath away. Then we build something new, together, if you're willing. Clara felt her heart skip a beat at the promise in his voice. Are you asking me to stay? Permanently? I'm asking you to take a chance on a man who's forgotten how to be around people, who might not be easy to live with, who's got scars and habits that 20 years of solitude have carved pretty deep. Ezekiel's voice was steady, but Clara could hear the uncertainty beneath the words. I'm asking if you think there might be room in your life for someone like me. Clara stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. I think, she said softly, that we're both carrying scars, but maybe together we can help each other heal. Ezekiel closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into her hand like a man starved for human contact. When he opened them again, Clara saw something that made her breath catch, not just desire but hope, real, fragile hope that had been carefully protected through 20 years of solitude. Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I need you to know, I'm not the same man I was before. The mountains have changed me, and I can't promise I'll know how to be what you need. And I'm not the same woman who stumbled to your door, Clara replied. I've been broken and put back together so many times I've lost count. But maybe that's exactly why this can work. We're both starting over, both learning how to live again. Before Ezekiel could respond, they heard the distant sound of horses on the trail below. More riders, moving fast and coming their way. Time to go, Ezekiel said, shouldering his pack. We can finish this conversation when we're somewhere safe. They led their horses out the back of the cabin and into the dense forest beyond, following a trail that existed only in Ezekiel's memory. Behind them, Clara's temporary sanctuary burned as Ezekiel had set it ablaze to cover their escape and deny shelter to their pursuers. She watched the flames consume the little cabin that had sheltered them both, feeling a pang of loss for the peace they were leaving behind. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, following paths known only to wildlife and the occasional hermit, Clara found herself looking forward rather than back. Beside her, Ezekiel moved with the confidence of a man who knew these peaks and valleys like his own soul. Her ankle, though still tender, held up well enough for riding, and she was grateful for the weeks of rest that had allowed it to heal. Ahead of them lay the unknown. Dangerous, certainly, but also full of possibilities. They traveled for 3 days through terrain that grew increasingly wild and remote. On the evening of the 3rd day, Ezekiel led them to a hidden valley that took Clara's breath away. Protected by towering cliffs on 3 sides and accessible only through a narrow canyon, it was like something from a dream. A crystal stream ran through the center, and the grass was still green despite the late autumn season. There's a cave system back in those rocks, Ezekiel explained as they made camp beside the stream. Natural chambers that stay warm year-round, fresh water, good hunting, and only one way in or out that can be easily defended. We could spend the winter here if we need to. Clara looked around the hidden valley with wonder. It's beautiful, like something that exists outside the normal world. I found it about 10 years ago, during a particularly bad winter. Always meant to come back, maybe build something permanent. Never had a reason to before now. That night, as they sat beside their campfire with the horses grazing nearby, Clara finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. Do you really think Victor will keep coming, even after what happened to his men? Ezekiel poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. Men like your husband don't give up easy. It's not just about getting you back anymore, it's about his reputation. If word gets out that someone defied him and got away with it, others might get ideas. So this isn't over, not by a long shot, but we've got advantages now. Time, terrain, and the fact that he doesn't know these mountains like I do. Come spring, We can make our way to California like you originally planned, or we can stay and make a stand. Your choice." Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance between them. "What would you choose if it were up to you?" "I'd choose to stop running," Ezekiel said without hesitation. "I've spent 20 years hiding from life, from pain, from everything that made me feel human. I'm tired of it. If Blackwood wants a fight, maybe it's time to give him one. Even if it means risking everything, especially then." Ezekiel met her eyes across the fire. "Clara, for 20 years I've had nothing to lose. Now I do, and that changes everything. A man with something worth protecting fights differently than one with nothing left." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Clara was gathering firewood near the cave mouth when she heard voices echoing from the canyon entrance. Her blood ran cold, thinking Victor's men had somehow tracked them to their refuge. But when Ezekiel emerged from the cave with his rifle, he was smiling. "Easy," he called to her. "They're friends." 3 men rode into the valley, and Clara immediately saw why Ezekiel had recognized them as allies. They wore the weathered clothes and confident bearing of mountain men, but more than that, they moved with the easy camaraderie of old companions. The leader was a grizzled man about Ezekiel's age, with a full gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. "Zeke," he called out as he dismounted, "heard you had some trouble down at your cabin." "News travels fast in these mountains, Murphy. Fast enough. When Jake Patterson came through my trading post babbling about gunfights and mysterious women, figured I'd better come see what kind of mess you'd gotten yourself into." Murphy's eyes found Clara, and she was surprised by the kindness in his weathered features. "Ma'am, I'm Seamus Murphy. These are my associates, Tom Brennan and Dave Hickory. We're what you might call concerned neighbors." Clara stepped forward, offering her hand. "Clara Whitmore. I'm afraid I'm the cause of Ezekiel's troubles." "Troubles have a way of finding a man whether he looks for them or not," Murphy replied. "Question is, what do we do about them now?" Over the next hour, as they shared coffee and hardtack around the fire, the full situation became clear. Murphy and his companions were part of an informal network of mountain men and independent settlers who looked out for each other in the vast wilderness. They'd heard about the gunfight at Ezekiel's cabin, and more importantly, they'd been asking questions about Victor Blackwood. "Your husband's got a reputation that reaches all the way up here," Tom Brennan said, his scarred face grim. "Man who's destroyed more than one family to build his empire. Some of us have been waiting for someone to stand up to him." "You're saying you'll help?" Clara asked, hardly daring to hope. "We're saying you're not alone in this fight," Dave Hickory replied. "Blackwood's been sending men into these mountains for weeks, threatening folks, trying to buy information. That doesn't sit well with people who value their independence." Ezekiel looked around the circle of faces, seeing something he'd forgotten existed: community. These men were offering not just their guns, but their solidarity. After 20 years of isolation, he was being welcomed back into the brotherhood of those who stood against injustice. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Murphy grinned, and Clara caught a glimpse of the young hellraiser he must have been decades ago. "Well, seems to me Blackwood's got himself overextended. He's sending men all over creation looking for your lady, spending money like water, making enemies. Might be time someone brought the fight to him instead of waiting for him to bring it to us." "You're talking about going after him directly," Clara said, her heart racing. "In Denver, where he has all the power." "Power's a funny thing," Murphy observed. "Looks solid from the outside, but it's usually built on foundations that ain't as strong as they appear. Man like Blackwood's got enemies, people he's wronged over the years. Sometimes all it takes is the right push to bring the whole structure down." They spent the rest of the day planning, pooling their knowledge of Blackwood's operations and weaknesses. Murphy had contacts in Denver, people who'd suffered under the man's influence and would be happy to see him fall. Tom Brennan had served in the war and knew about tactics and strategy. Dave Hickory was simply the best tracker in the territory and could get them where they needed to go unseen. But it was Clara who provided the most crucial element, the documents she'd stolen from Victor's safe. Proof of murders, bribery, illegal land deals, and connections to criminal organizations that would destroy him if they became public. These papers, Murphy said, examining them carefully, they're enough to hang him 10 times over. Question is, how to get them to the right people without getting ourselves killed in the process. I know a federal judge in Colorado Springs, Ezekiel said quietly. Man named Harrison Pierce. Served with him during my sheriff days, and he's as honest as they come. If we can get these documents to him, along with Clara's testimony, Blackwood's finished. Clara felt a flutter of hope mixed with fear. But getting to Colorado Springs means exposing ourselves. Once we leave these mountains, we're vulnerable. Not if we do it right, Tom said. Blackwood's got men watching the main trails, but there are other ways. Harder ways that most folks wouldn't think to use. They planned through the evening, mapping routes and contingencies, preparing for what would essentially be a small war against a powerful enemy. As the others settled into their bedrolls around the dying fire, Ezekiel found himself walking with Clara along the stream that ran through the valley. "You're having second thoughts," he observed, noting the tension in her shoulders. "I'm terrified," Clara admitted. "These men are willing to risk everything to help us, and I'm not sure I'm worth it." Ezekiel stopped walking and turned to face her. "You listen to me, Clara Whitmore. You are worth it. Worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth building a life with. Don't let that bastard's abuse convince you otherwise." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "How can you be so sure? You barely know me." "I know enough." Ezekiel's voice was gentle but firm. "I know you're brave enough to run from a life that was destroying you. I know you're kind enough to worry about strangers who've offered to help. I know you're strong enough to survive things that would have broken lesser people. And I know that somewhere along the way, you've become the most important thing in my world." Before Clara could respond, Ezekiel cupped her face in his weathered hands and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he were afraid she might pull away. When she didn't, when she instead melted against him and kissed him back with equal fervor, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of need and hope and the promise of healing. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Clara rested her forehead against Ezekiel's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of the stream. "I love you too," Ezekiel replied, his arms tightening around her. "Which is why we're going to see this through. We're going to stop Victor Blackwood. And then we're going to build the life we both deserve." The next morning, their small army broke camp and began the dangerous journey toward Colorado Springs. They traveled at night when possible, using game trails and abandoned mining roads that appeared on no official maps. Murphy's knowledge of the territory proved invaluable, as did his network of allies who provided shelter and supplies along the way. But their greatest asset was Ezekiel himself. As they descended from the high country into more populated areas, Clara watched him transform once again. The mountain hermit disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who moved with the quiet authority of a natural leader. When they encountered problems, suspicious locals, overzealous territorial marshals, or signs that Blackwood's men were close, Ezekiel handled them with a combination of diplomacy and barely concealed menace that got results. "You're different," Clara observed on their fourth night as they made camp in a hidden canyon 20 miles from Colorado Springs. "How so?" "You're commanding, like you were born to lead people." Ezekiel smiled ruefully. "I was good at my job once upon a time, before I lost my family and forgot who I was supposed to be. Guess some things don't fade, even after 20 years. Is that what you want? To go back to being a lawman?" "I want to be whatever I need to be to protect the people I care about," Ezekiel replied. "Beyond that, we'll figure it out as we go." The next day, they reached Colorado Springs. Judge Pierce was exactly as Ezekiel remembered him, a tall, dignified man with iron-grey hair and eyes that could see through any lie. When Ezekiel presented Clara's evidence and testimony, the judge's expression grew progressively darker. "This is damning material," Pierce said finally. "More than enough to issue warrants for Blackwood's arrest on multiple federal charges. But getting him to trial alive will be the challenge. A man with this much to lose won't go quietly." "That's where we come in," Murphy said. "We've got men positioned around his estate in Denver, watching his movements. Soon as you issue those warrants, we'll be ready to act." Pierce leaned back in his chair, studying the weathered faces of the men arrayed before him. "You understand, this isn't strictly legal. Taking the law into your own hands, even for good reasons, has consequences." "Some things are more important than strict legality," Ezekiel replied. "Sometimes you have to choose between what's legal and what's right." The judge was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll issue the warrants. Federal charges that supersede any local influence Blackwood might have. But I want him taken alive if possible. Justice works best when it's seen to be done properly." They left Colorado Springs that evening with federal warrants in hand and a small army of volunteers who'd joined their cause. Word of Blackwood's crimes had spread quickly through the network of people who'd suffered under his influence, and men who'd lost family members or livelihoods to his greed were eager for the chance to see him brought to justice. The assault on Blackwood's Denver mansion came at dawn 5 days later. Ezekiel led one group through the front entrance, while Murphy's men secured the back. Tom and Dave positioned themselves to cut off any escape routes, and Clara waited with a small reserve force ready to provide support where needed, her ankle now strong enough to bear her weight during the action. The battle was brief but fierce. Blackwood's hired gunmen were skilled, but they were facing men who fought not for money but for justice. When the smoke cleared, Victor Blackwood knelt in his own parlor with his hands bound behind his back, facing the woman he'd thought he owned. "Clara," he said, his voice still carrying that smooth charm that had once deceived her. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Come home with me, and we can work this out." Clara looked down at the man who'd terrorized her for years and felt only pity. "The only place you're going, Victor, is prison, and then, God willing, to the gallows." Blackwood's mask finally slipped, revealing the monster beneath. "You think this is over? I have friends, influence. I'll be out in a month, and when I am, I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "No," Ezekiel said quietly, stepping forward. "You won't. Because there are people watching you now, people who know what you are. Step out of line even once, and they'll be waiting." Judge Pierce arrived that afternoon with federal marshals to take Blackwood into custody. As they loaded him into a prison wagon, he looked back at Clara with such hatred that she felt a chill despite the warm spring air. "It's really over," she said, hardly able to believe it. "It's over," Ezekiel confirmed, pulling her close. "Now we can start living." The trial that followed was a sensation, with newspapers across the territory reporting on the downfall of one of Denver's most prominent citizens. Victor Blackwood was convicted on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering, and sentenced to hang. Clara testified bravely, her quiet dignity winning over even skeptics who'd initially doubted her story. But for Clara and Ezekiel, the trial was just the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. They were married in a simple ceremony in Colorado Springs, with Judge Pierce performing the service and Murphy and his mountain men serving as witnesses. "So what now?" Clara asked as they stood on the courthouse steps after the ceremony, her hand tucked securely in Ezekiel's arm. "Now we go home," Ezekiel replied, "back to that hidden valley where this all began. We'll build a cabin, maybe start a family if we're blessed, and we'll live the kind of life we both thought we'd lost the chance for." Clara smiled up at her husband, seeing in his eyes the same hope and determination that had carried them through their darkest hours. "It sounds perfect." They returned to their mountain sanctuary as summer was reaching its peak, the hidden valley green and lush with wildflowers. Working together, they built a sturdy cabin near the stream, with windows that looked out on the towering peaks and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set behind the mountains. Murphy and the others visited regularly, bringing news from the outside world and supplies they couldn't produce themselves. But mostly, Clara and Ezekiel lived in blissful isolation, healing from their respective traumas and learning how to be happy again. On quiet evenings, Clara would read aloud from books, while Ezekiel worked on some project or simply listened to the sound of her voice. Sometimes they would talk about the past, sharing memories and pain in the way that people do when they trust each other completely. And sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, content in the knowledge that they were no longer alone. 2 years after their wedding, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. As Ezekiel held his new child for the first time, Clara saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Perfect." "She is," Clara agreed, reaching up to touch her husband's face. "And she's going to grow up knowing she's loved and protected, the way every child should." Ezekiel nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. This tiny person sleeping in his arms represented everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. Family, future, the chance to watch someone grow and learn and become their own person. As seasons passed and their daughter grew, Clara and Ezekiel's love deepened into something strong and unshakable. They faced the usual challenges of frontier life: harsh winters, supply shortages, the occasional visit from unwelcome wildlife, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. Hope proved to be a curious, adventurous child who loved exploring the valley with her parents. She learned to ride almost before she could walk properly, and by the age of 5, she could track animals and identify edible plants with the skill of someone twice her age. Clara taught her to read and write, while Ezekiel passed on the practical skills needed for mountain living. "She's going to be formidable," Clara observed one evening as they watched their 7-year-old daughter carefully cleaning a fish she'd caught herself. "She gets that from her mother," Ezekiel replied with a smile. "The stubborn independence and the refusal to be intimidated by anything. And from her father, she gets the quiet strength and the protective instincts," Clara added. "She's going to be able to take care of herself in this world." They'd made the right choice, Clara realized as she looked around their mountain home. The outside world continued its complex dance of progress and conflict, but here in their hidden valley, they'd found something more precious than gold or power. They'd found peace. Of course, they weren't completely cut off from civilization. Murphy's trading post served as their connection to the wider world, and occasionally they would make trips down to Colorado Springs or Denver for supplies and news. On one such trip, when Hope was 10 years old, they learned that Victor Blackwood had finally been executed for his crimes. "How do you feel?" Ezekiel asked Clara as they read the newspaper account together. "Free," Clara replied simply. "Finally. Completely free." But freedom, they'd learned, was something you had to choose every day. It wasn't just the absence of external threats, but the presence of love, hope, and the courage to keep building something beautiful, even in an uncertain world. Our stories here on the channel are entirely fictional, crafted to inspire and entertain, and we mean no offense to anyone. Thank you for joining Clara and Ezekiel on their journey from isolation to love, from fear to courage, and from the past to a hope-filled future. If you enjoyed this tale of second chances in the Old West, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, leave us a comment about what touched your heart most, and share it with friends who appreciate stories of redemption and love. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to start over, and sometimes the most broken people are capable of the most beautiful healing.